The following assessment remains classified and is not to be referenced in any unclassified publication, briefing, or press engagement. That line appears on page 3 of a Pentagon after-action summary dated March 1988. The document sat in a filing cabinet in the Defense Intelligence Agency's South Asian desk for nearly 2 decades, before portions of it surfaced through a Freedom of Information request in 2006. Even then, whole paragraphs came back redacted, thick black bars covering names, unit designations, engagement coordinates. What survived the censor's marker told a story the United States government had gone to considerable effort to keep quiet. Between 1986 and 1988, Pakistani Air Force pilots flying American-made F-16 Fighting Falcons shot down at least 10 Soviet and Afghan aircraft along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. They lost 0. 10-0. A perfect record. The most flawless F-16 combat tally ever recorded, achieved not by American hands, but by pilots the Americans had trained, flying jets the Americans had sold, in a war the Americans were funding through the largest covert operation in CIA history. And Washington wanted nobody to know about it. The reasons were tangled up in the particular madness of Cold War diplomacy. Pakistan was supposed to be a neutral party. The fiction mattered. Soviet MiGs and Sukhois were crossing into Pakistani airspace, sometimes deliberately, sometimes while chasing Mujahideen fighters back across the border from Afghanistan. And Pakistani F-16s were killing them. If that story got out with any official American fingerprints on it, the escalation ladder got shorter. Moscow could frame it as direct American aggression by proxy. The Reagan administration needed Pakistan's cooperation for the Afghan pipeline, needed the Soviets to keep bleeding in Afghanistan, and needed the whole arrangement to stay deniable. So the kill board never existed, officially. If you think you already know this story, drop it in the comments. What you've heard, what you think happened. Subscribe if you're new here. Hit like if by the end I've shown you something that wasn't in the version you knew. Because the version most people know has gaps the size of filing cabinets. The Pakistani pilots who flew those missions operated under restrictions that would have made an American squadron commander tear his hair out. Rules of engagement required visual identification before firing. In an era when beyond visual range missiles were becoming standard, these men had to close to distances where they could physically see the red stars on the aircraft they were about to kill. They carried AIM-9L Sidewinders, excellent heat-seeking missiles, but short range. No Sparrows, no AMRAAMs. The Americans had sold Pakistan the jet, but kept the longest spears locked in the armory. And still 10-0. The Soviet pilots they faced were not amateurs. Many had rotated through Afghanistan on combat tours. They flew MiG-23 Floggers and Su-25 Fitters, aircraft with known limitations, sure, but flown by men who understood those limitations and had learned to work within them. One engagement in April 1987 involved a Pakistani F-16 piloted by squadron leader Badr-ul-Islam, intercepting a pair of Afghan Air Force Su-22s that had crossed the border during a ground attack mission. He dropped both in under 90 seconds. The after-action summary describes the engagement geometry in dry technical language, but the math underneath it is stark. 2 aircraft, 2 missiles, 2 kills. Nothing wasted, no second pass needed. The Americans studied these engagements with the intensity of men watching their own product perform under conditions they couldn't replicate at home. Gun camera tapes, radar tracks, debrief transcripts, satellite intercepts, all of it got pulled back to Langley and to Tactical Air Command headquarters. The F-16 was proving itself in exactly the kind of contested airspace it had been designed for, against exactly the kind of Soviet-built opponents it was meant to face. The data was pure gold. But gold nobody could spend. The intelligence had to stay compartmented. The kill ratio couldn't appear in F-16 marketing material, couldn't be cited in congressional briefings or NATO readiness assessments. General Dynamics, the company that built the jet, knew the broad strokes but couldn't say a word publicly. No F-16 combat record before or since has matched it, and for all practical purposes, it was a secret. The jet that made all of it possible weighed just over 16,500 pounds empty. Lean for a fighter. The F-16A Block 15 that Pakistan received, starting in 1983, was, pound for pound, the most agile combat aircraft on the planet. Its Pratt & Whitney F-100PW200 engine produced roughly 23,800 pounds of thrust in afterburner, meaning the aircraft could accelerate while climbing straight up, a thrust-to-weight ratio greater than 1. Most Soviet fighters of that era couldn't say the same, but the airframe's real trick wasn't raw power. It was the fly-by-wire flight control system, the first ever installed in a production fighter. No mechanical linkage connected the pilot's stick to the control surfaces. Electrical signals did. A computer sat between the man and the machine, interpreting inputs, filtering out overcorrections, allowing the aircraft to be designed with relaxed, static stability. In plain language, the F-16 wanted to turn. Left alone, it would have tumbled out of control. The computer kept it honest, and that instability became an advantage. The jet could snap into maneuvers that conventionally stable aircraft physically could not match. A Soviet pilot pulling 6 Gs in a MiG-23 was fighting his airplane. A Pakistani pilot pulling 9 Gs in an F-16 was working with his. Getting those jets to Islamabad had required an act of congressional contortion that bordered on the absurd. Pakistan's nuclear weapons program was an open secret by the early 1980s. The Symington and Glenn amendments to the Foreign Assistance Act should have prohibited military sales to any country pursuing unsafeguarded nuclear enrichment. Pakistan was enriching uranium at Kahuta. Everyone knew it. The CIA, the State Department, Congress itself. And Congress sold them 40 F-16s anyway, because Afghanistan mattered more than nonproliferation, at least that year. President Reagan personally certified that Pakistan did not possess a nuclear device, a statement that was technically true and strategically dishonest in roughly equal measure. The deal came with strings that frayed over time. Washington insisted on end-use monitoring. American technical representatives lived on Pakistani air bases, ostensibly to oversee maintenance and ensure the aircraft weren't modified or redeployed in ways the sale agreement didn't cover. Pakistani officers tolerated this with the tight-lipped courtesy of men who needed the hardware badly enough to accept the babysitters who came with it. The Americans checked serial numbers on missiles, inspected wing pylons, filed reports. They also watched Pakistani pilots train. What they saw impressed them more than some of them expected. The Pressler Amendment, passed in 1985, gave Congress a kill switch. If the president could no longer certify Pakistan's nuclear status, all military aid would stop. Every F-16 spare part, every engine overhaul, every missile shipment, every scheduled avionics upgrade, gone. The pilots flying those jets knew the clock was always running. If the political winds shifted, their aircraft would become the most expensive lawn ornaments in South Asia. The afterburner lit and the desert floor fell away at a rate that made the altimeter spin like a broken clock. 40 miles north of Phoenix, over the brown emptiness of the Sonoran Range complex, Pakistani pilots were learning to kill in American airspace. Luke Air Force Base, the largest fighter pilot training installation in the Western world, ran its F-16 conversion courses with a brutal efficiency that left little room for national pride or cultural sensitivity. The instructors were American, the doctrine was American, and foreign students were expected to either meet the standard or wash out. The Pakistanis had no intention of washing out. The heat alone was something to survive. Summer temperatures at Luke pushed 115 degrees on the flight line. Ground crews working the tarmac wore gloves not for safety regulations, but because bare skin on sun-baked aluminum meant second-degree burns. The Pakistani students, most of them experienced fighter pilots already, men who had flown Mirage 3s and Shenyang F-6s, arrived in Arizona expecting difficulty. What they got was immersion. Dawn briefs at 4:30 a.m. 2 sorties a day when the schedule allowed. Classroom sessions on energy management, radar interpretation, weapons employment. Then the evening debrief, which at Luke was less a conversation than an autopsy. Every mistake dissected, every hesitation questioned. "They stripped us down to nothing and rebuilt us," one Pakistani pilot later told a defense journalist in a rare on-the-record comment. "We came in thinking we knew how to fly fighters. They taught us we knew how to fly airplanes." The distinction mattered. Flying an airplane meant maintaining control, executing procedures, navigating from point to point. Flying a fighter meant thinking in 3 dimensions while someone tried to kill you, managing energy states and closure rates and weapons envelopes simultaneously, making decisions at speeds where a 2-second delay turned a kill into a funeral. The American instructors at Luke had been doing this since Vietnam, refining the methodology through decades of red flag exercises and aggressor squadron programs. They had studied Soviet tactics with an obsessiveness that bordered on the academic. They knew how MiG-21s turned. They knew the radar limitations of the MiG-23. They built training scenarios around those specific aircraft because those were the aircraft their students would face. And the Pakistanis absorbed it with a hunger that surprised even the veterans. None of this complexity shows up in official training records. These were proud men from a proud military tradition, submitting to instruction from officers of a foreign power because the alternative was flying inferior equipment into a war they couldn't afford to lose. Some of the American instructors at Luke had never worked with Pakistani students before. The early weeks involved a quiet mutual assessment, the Americans watching whether these pilots had the baseline skills to handle the F-16. The Pakistanis deciding whether these Americans had anything worth learning. Both sides found what they were looking for. By the mid-1980s, Pakistani graduates of the Luke program were returning to bases at Sargodha and Kamra with a tactical vocabulary that didn't exist in the Pakistan Air Force 5 years earlier. They thought in terms of energy diagrams, corner velocity, the geometry of lead pursuit curves. They understood the Sidewinder not just as a missile but as a probability equation, aspect angle, target heat signature, seeker gimbal limits, minimum range. The Americans had given them more than a weapon system. They had given them a way of thinking about aerial combat that was the accumulated product of every dogfight America had won and lost since Korea. The irony was thick enough to taste. These pilots would go home and fly combat missions that validated everything the Americans had taught them, proved the F-16's superiority over Soviet-built opponents in exactly the way Tactical Air Command had always theorized, and none of it could be discussed at the next NATO planning conference. The graduates of Luke Air Force Base were about to compile the cleanest F-16 combat record in history, and their American instructors would have to read about it in classified cables rather than congratulate them over a beer at the officers' club. The map hung in the operations room at Kamra, laminated and coffee-stained, covered in grease pencil marks that were erased and redrawn so often the surface had gone cloudy. It showed a border that ran for roughly 1,500 miles from the Iranian frontier in the southwest to the Chinese border in the far northeast. The Durand Line, drawn by a British civil servant in 1893 with the confidence of a man who would never have to defend it. The terrain underneath those grease pencil marks was some of the most vertical geography on Earth. Peaks above 20,000 feet, valleys so narrow that radar beams couldn't reach the bottom, passes that funneled air traffic into corridors as predictable as highway on-ramps, and everywhere ridgelines that blocked radar like walls. Pakistani air defense controllers had marked the map with colored overlays showing radar coverage. The colors told an ugly story. Along the northern stretch, Chitral, Dir, Bajor, the coverage was a patchwork of blind spots. Ground-based radar couldn't see over the Hindu Kush. Airborne early warning aircraft didn't exist in Pakistan's inventory yet. Soviet and Afghan pilots had learned exactly where those gaps were, and they exploited them with a regularity that suggested someone on the other side had done their homework. If an Su-22 pilot stayed below 8,000 feet in certain valleys, he could cross into Pakistani airspace, deliver ordnance on a Mujahideen camp, and turn back toward Jalalabad before anyone in Peshawar even knew he'd been there. The crossings accelerated sharply after 1985. The Mujahideen had started receiving Stinger missiles through the CYA pipeline, and the Soviets responded by pushing their air operations closer to the border, sometimes across it. Afghan government aircraft were even less disciplined. Their pilots chased guerrilla columns without much regard for where the Durand Line fell, partly because the Afghan government had never formally recognized the border in the first place. Kabul's official position was that the line was a colonial imposition. A convenient stance when your bombs landed on the wrong side of it. Islamabad tolerated the violations longer than most governments would have. The logic was straightforward. Every diplomatic protest filed with Moscow bought time for the CIA's weapons pipeline to keep flowing through Peshawar and Quetta. But tolerance had a shelf life. By mid-1986, Pakistani villages were taking casualties from errant bombs. Refugee camps near the border, sprawling, overcrowded, barely administered, were being hit. The domestic political pressure on President Zia-ul-Haq was becoming impossible to manage with diplomatic notes alone. The scramble order, when it finally became standing policy, was deceptively simple. F-16s from No. 9 Squadron at Sargodha and No. 14 Squadron at Kamra would maintain combat air patrols along designated border sectors. If ground radar or visual observers confirmed an incursion, the nearest pair would intercept. Rules of engagement required positive visual identification before weapons release. The pilots had to get close enough to read tail numbers, close enough to see the pilot's helmet in the cockpit before they could shoot. If the Soviets had waited another 6 months to escalate their border crossings, Pakistan's F-16 pilots would have been greener, less integrated with their ground control networks, still working out the kinks in their alert procedures. But the Soviets were on their own timeline. The first intercepts came in the spring of 1986. The grease pencil marks on that laminated map at Kamra started getting new annotations, small X's with dates next to them, clustered along the northern border sectors where the radar couldn't see and the mountains funneled everything into killing boxes. The F-16 pilots had a phrase for those corridors. They called them the shooting gallery. Miranshah sits at roughly 4,000 feet above sea level, a dusty garrison town in North Waziristan that exists primarily because the British built a fort there in 1904 and nobody ever found a good reason to tear it down. On the morning of May 16, 1986, the forward operating post near Miranshah picked up radio chatter from across the border. Afghan Air Force frequencies, pilots talking to ground controllers at coast in the clipped, hurried Dari that Pakistani signals intelligence operators had learned to recognize as a prelude to a strike mission. Flight Lieutenant Hamid Anwar was already airborne. He had launched from Kamra on a routine combat air patrol, flying northwest along the border corridor with his wingman trailing about 1.5 miles back. The APG-66 radar in the nose of his F-16 was scanning a 60-degree cone ahead, but at the altitudes where Afghan pilots like to operate, low, hugging terrain, the radar was nearly useless. Ground clutter swallowed everything. The kill, if it came, would come from eyeballs first. Ground control called the contact at 11:42 a.m. 2 aircraft heading east, low altitude, crossing the border near the Shawal Valley. Anwar pushed the throttle forward and dropped his nose toward the valley floor. His fuel state gave him maybe 25 minutes of combat time before he'd need to turn for home. The Sidewinder on his left wingtip rail was an AIM-9 Lima, the all-aspect variant that could track a target from the front, not just from behind. The Afghans almost certainly didn't know he carried it. He spotted the lead aircraft at roughly 4 miles. And Su-25 Fitter, unmistakable in profile, that distinctive variable geometry wing swept back for speed. The fat belly of an aircraft loaded with bombs meant for someone on the Pakistani side of the line. The fitter was running fast and low, maybe 200 feet above the valley floor, threading between ridgelines that rose sharply on both sides. Anwar closed to just under 2 miles. The Sidewinder's infrared seeker found the fitter's exhaust plume, and the tone in his headset shifted from a searching warble to a high, steady growl, the sound that meant the missile had locked. He pressed the pickle button. The AIM-9 Lima came off the rail with a white flash and a corkscrew of smoke, tracking hard toward the Afghan jet. Impact took less than 4 seconds. The fitter broke apart against a backdrop of brown rock and blue sky, scattering wreckage across a ridgeline that had no name on any Pakistani map. The wingman turned back toward Afghanistan. Anwar let him go. The first kill opened a door nobody in Washington wanted to walk through. The State Department's South Asia desk had spent months crafting language designed to keep Pakistan's F-16 program out of the newspapers. Defensive posture, territorial integrity, proportional response to airspace incursions. Bureaucratic fog, thick enough to hide a war behind. But dead aircraft leave wreckage, and wreckage draws questions. And questions were exactly what the Reagan administration didn't need while it was simultaneously arming the Mujahideen through Pakistani territory and telling Congress the whole operation was manageable. The Pakistanis kept killing anyway. Between May 1986 and November 1988, F-16s from No. 9 Squadron and No. 14 Squadron engaged Afghan and Soviet aircraft on at least 10 separate occasions along the border. The target list read like a catalog of Soviet-era exports. An An-26 transport, a lumbering twin turboprop with all the agility of a school bus, was caught inside Pakistani airspace near Pressler in the Kurram Valley. The pilot probably never saw the F-16 that killed him. And Su-25 Frogfoot, the Soviet equivalent of the A-10 Warthog, went down over the tribal areas after straying across the line during a close-air support mission. The Frogfoot was armored, built to absorb ground fire from heavy machine guns. A Sidewinder doesn't care about armor plating. It finds the hottest point on an airframe and detonates a fragmenting warhead at Mach 2.5. The distinction between armored and survivable became academic in about 3 seconds. The engagements that worried Moscow most involved the MiG-23 Flogger. Unlike the Su-22s and Frogfoots, dedicated ground attack platforms with limited air-to-air capability, the Flogger was a proper fighter interceptor. Variable sweep wings, a decent radar, R-23 and R-60 missiles that could theoretically threaten an F-16 in a head-on pass. On paper, a MiG-23 engagement should have been competitive. Squadron leader Badr-ul-Islam didn't find it competitive. He found the Flogger on radar, close to visual range per the rules of engagement, identified Afghan markings on the fuselage, and put a Sidewinder into it with what his debrief described as textbook parameters. The variable geometry wings didn't help. The beyond visual range missiles and the 23mm cannon didn't either. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds from first radar contact to impact. Islam was back at Kamra in time for afternoon prayers. A Soviet after-action assessment obtained years later through a German academic who had access to former Eastern Bloc military archives used a phrase that translates roughly as unacceptable tactical asymmetry. The report noted that Pakistani F-16 pilots appeared to have training and situational awareness consistent with NATO standard fighter operations, which was, of course, exactly what they had. The Soviets knew the Americans had trained these men. They knew the missiles were American. They knew the radar was American. What they couldn't do was say so publicly without admitting their own aircraft were crossing an international border to bomb civilian areas. So both superpowers maintained the fiction. Washington pretended the kills weren't happening, and Moscow returned the favor by pretending the border violations weren't either. Islamabad released terse statements about unidentified aircraft that were engaged after entering Pakistani sovereign airspace. The Pakistani pilots themselves were under strict orders not to discuss operations with anyone outside their squadron. Families knew only that their husbands and sons were flying a lot of hours. The kill markers, small silhouettes painted on aircraft shelters rather than on the jets themselves, because even that level of visibility was considered too risky, accumulated in a place where only squadron personnel could see them. The American defense attaché in Islamabad sent cables back to the Pentagon after each confirmed engagement. These cables, portions of which were declassified in 2004, contain attention that practically vibrates off the page. The attaché clearly understood he was documenting something extraordinary. A perfect combat record for an American-built fighter flown by American-trained pilots using American weapons and American tactics against the primary adversary those weapons and tactics had been designed to defeat. Each engagement validated decades of American fighter doctrine. Each kill proved the F-16 concept worked exactly as advertised. But each cable also carried a classification header that ensured none of it would reach the people who most needed to hear it: the American taxpayers who had funded the entire program. 10 confirmed kills, 0 losses. Across roughly 30 months of intermittent air combat along one of the most geographically hostile borders on Earth, Pakistani F-16s maintained a kill ratio that mathematicians would call undefined. You can't divide by 0. General Dynamics engineers in Fort Worth would have put that number on every brochure and trade show display, on every pitch to Allied Air Forces shopping for a new fighter. Instead, they put it nowhere. The breakdown, reconstructed from Pakistani Air Force records and corroborated by fragments of the declassified attaché cables, looks like this. 3 Su-25 fitters destroyed. All ground attack variants caught inside Pakistani airspace on bomb runs. 2 Su-25 Frogfoots, both engaged at low altitude over the tribal areas. 1 MiG-23 Flogger, the fighter interceptor that was supposed to be the dangerous one. 1 and 26 Transport, which had no business being where it was and no capability to defend itself once found. The remaining 3 kills involve aircraft types that sources don't fully agree on, either additional fitters or possibly an older MiG-21. Pakistani records from that period are not models of archival consistency. The total stays at 10, regardless of which variant filled the last 3 slots. The missile expenditure tells its own story. Pakistani pilots fired fewer than 15 Sidewinders to achieve those 10 kills. Most engagements were single missile affairs. Anwar's first kill over Miranshah: 1 shot, 1 kill. Islam's Flogger intercept: 1 round off the rail, 1 MiG turned to scrap metal tumbling down a mountainside. The hit rate exceeded 65% across all engagements, a number so far above the historical average for infrared missiles in combat that American analysts flagged it for review. During Vietnam, the AIM-9's kill probability hovered around 15%. Over the Falklands, the British managed roughly 80% with the newer Lima variant, but in far less demanding terrain and against Argentine pilots who often didn't know they were being tracked. The Pakistanis achieved their numbers in valleys, where a missed shot meant a Sidewinder burying itself in a granite cliff face, where targets flew so low that the infrared seeker had to distinguish between engine exhaust and sun-heated rock, where the F-16 pilot had maybe 1 firing opportunity before the target disappeared behind a ridgeline or crossed back into Afghan airspace beyond the rules of engagement. 1 chance and 1 missile to spend on it. Squadron leader Khalid Mahmoud scored his kill on a November afternoon in 1988, one of the last engagements before the Soviet withdrawal made the border crossings taper off. His Sidewinder tracked true for 6 seconds, longer than most, because the target, an Su-22, was in a shallow climb away from him, the exhaust plume bright and clean against cold mountain air. The flash, when the warhead detonated, lit the inside of his cockpit orange for half a heartbeat. He noted the time on his kneeboard card: 4:23 p.m. The shadows in the valley below were already long. Somewhere in Fort Worth, a General Dynamics sales team was preparing a capability brief for the Royal Thai Air Force. The brief contained performance charts, reliability statistics, maintenance cost projections, and life cycle support timelines. It did not contain a single reference to the 10-0 record being compiled in real time along the Afghan border. The best advertisement the F-16 ever earned was the one its manufacturer was forbidden to use. The Pakistani Air Force has demonstrated combat effectiveness with the F-16 platform that exceeds initial program expectations. That sentence, buried on page 11 of a 1987 Defense Security Assistance Agency review, is followed immediately by a paragraph explaining why the review itself could never be shared with the Foreign Military Sales Office responsible for promoting the F-16 abroad. Acknowledging the combat record meant acknowledging combat had occurred. Acknowledging combat meant acknowledging border violations. Acknowledging border violations meant acknowledging the Soviet-Afghan War was spilling into Pakistan. And acknowledging that meant Congress would start asking what else was spilling into Pakistan, specifically centrifuge components spinning at 60,000 revolutions per minute in a facility at Kahuta. The Pressler Amendment landed on the books in 1985, 1 year before Anwar's first kill. Senator Larry Pressler of South Dakota had introduced language requiring the president to certify annually that Pakistan did not possess a nuclear explosive device. Without that certification, all American military assistance would stop. All of it. Every spare part, every training slot at Luke, every Sidewinder in the pipeline. If the combat record had become public, if some enterprising journalist had connected the kill silhouettes on those squadron shelters to the American-built missiles that made them possible, the entire arrangement would have collapsed under its own contradictions. The Reagan White House was certifying Pakistan's nuclear innocence each year with what intelligence officials later admitted was willful blindness. Drawing attention to Pakistani F-16 combat operations meant drawing attention to Pakistan, period. And attention was poison. So, the bureaucratic machinery did what bureaucratic machinery does best. It filed things away. The attaché cables went into classified archives. The after-action reviews circulated within a distribution list so narrow that retired Air Force General Charles Horner, the man who would later command all coalition air assets in Desert Storm, told an interviewer in 2006 that he hadn't known the full scope of the Pakistani record until years after the fact. "I knew they'd had some engagements," Horner said. "I did not know it was a perfect sheet." The Pressler axe finally fell in 1990 when President George H.W. Bush declined to issue the annual certification. Military aid froze overnight. 28 F-16s that Pakistan had already paid for, aircraft sitting finished on the General Dynamics production line, were embargoed in their hangars. The pilots who had compiled the most dominant air-to-air record of the Cold War's final decade were grounded by paperwork. 11 F-16s. That's how many combat-ready airframes Pakistan had left by 1992, 2 years after the Pressler sanctions cut the supply line. 11 jets to cover 1,500 miles of border. The math was brutal, and it got worse every month because without access to American spare parts, each flight hour cannibalized the fleet a little further. O-rings degraded. Turbine blades crept toward their fatigue limits. The APG-66 radar sets, the same systems that had guided Sidewinders into 10 Soviet-built aircraft without a single miss, started throwing fault codes that Pakistani technicians could diagnose but couldn't fix, because the replacement modules sat in a bonded warehouse in Fort Worth, Texas, behind a padlock that had the full weight of the United States Senate behind it. The 28 embargoed jets became a symbol that curdled fast. Pakistan had paid $558 million for those aircraft. Paid in full, up front, in an era when Pakistan's per capita income hovered around $370 a year. The money came from a nation where villages shared a single water pump, where infant mortality rates would have scandalized a Victorian-era health inspector. And the aircraft those dollars purchased sat in climate-controlled storage at what was now the Lockheed Martin plant, accruing maintenance fees that Pakistan was also expected to pay. Storage charges for jets they owned but couldn't have. A Pakistani diplomat described the arrangement to a Washington Post reporter in 1993 as paying rent on your own furniture while the landlord changes the locks. The State Department declined to comment. Back at Kamra and Sargodha, the men who had built the 10-0 record watched their profession dissolve around them. Flight hours dropped below the minimum needed to maintain combat proficiency. Squadron leader Anwar, the man who had drawn first blood over Miranshah, whose single Sidewinder shot had validated everything Luke Air Force Base had ever taught, was flying a desk by 1991. The younger pilots, the ones who had joined the F-16 squadrons expecting to inherit a legacy of dominance, found themselves training in Chengdu F-7s instead. Chinese-built copies of the MiG-21. The same basic airframe their predecessors had been killing just 3 years earlier. Nobody has found a more efficient way to demolish institutional morale. The strategic damage ran deeper than grounded jets. Pakistan's nuclear program hadn't paused for the sanctions. Aq Khan's centrifuges kept spinning at Kahuta regardless of what Congress did about F-16 deliveries. And the message Islamabad received was unambiguous. America would arm you when it needed you, celebrate your kills in classified cables, train your pilots to NATO standard, take your money for 28 fighter aircraft, and then hold those aircraft hostage the moment the relationship became inconvenient. All the trust built, sortie by sortie, over the skies of Arizona, tested missile by missile over the Hindu Kush, it evaporated in a budget office. Washington eventually sold the embargoed jets to New Zealand's Air Force in 1998, refunded Pakistan a portion of the money, kept the rest for storage fees. The pilots scattered. Many retired early, taking positions with Gulf Airlines, where the pay was better and nobody asked them to pretend they hadn't fought a war. Others transferred to other airframes and spent the 90s flying equipment a generation behind what they'd been trained on. A handful stayed in the F-16 program through sheer stubbornness, nursing the remaining fleet through a decade of sanctions with improvised repairs and a parts pipeline that relied on back channels the Pakistani government has never officially acknowledged. The operational readiness rate for Pakistan's F-16 fleet dropped below 50% by 1995. Half the jets couldn't fly on any given day. The other half probably shouldn't have. Squadron leader Sadr Alvi, who had scored one of the later kills in 1988, left the Air Force in 1994. His resignation letter, portions of which were quoted in a Pakistani defense journal years later, contained a single line that his commanding officer reportedly read twice before signing the paperwork. "I was trained by the best Air Force in the world to fly the best fighter in the world, and I am now maintaining a museum exhibit." Alvi was 34 years old. He took a job flying Boeing 737s for Pakistan International Airlines out of Karachi. The route was Karachi to Dubai, twice a day, 6 days a week. Wheels up at 6:15 a.m. The cockpit of a 737 doesn't shake when you light the engine. Nothing pushes you back into the seat. The altimeter climbs at a pace you can read with your eyes. The Sidewinder sits behind glass at the Pakistan Air Force Museum in Karachi, mounted on a plain wooden cradle with a placard that reads AIM-9L and nothing else. No kill markings, no mission date, no pilot's name. The seeker head behind the infrared dome has gone cloudy with age, the way old glass does in subtropical humidity. A faint, milky film over the lens that once tracked engine exhaust at Mach 2.5. The fins show handling scratches from ground crew who loaded it onto a wing rail sometime in the late 1980s. It could be any Sidewinder from any conflict. That's the point. In a filing cabinet at the Defense Security Assistance Agency, or more likely in a digitized archive that replaced the filing cabinet sometime around 2004, the after-action summaries still carry their original classification headers. Portions were declassified in batches through the 2000s, enough for researchers to reconstruct the broad timeline. The operational details that matter most remain redacted. Black bars over pilot names, engagement coordinates, missile serial numbers. A 1989 cable from the Islamabad attaché office contains a paragraph that begins mid-sentence after a redaction block and reads, "Confirming the platform's lethality envelope exceeds theater requirements by a significant margin." The sentence before it, whatever context would explain what prompted that assessment, stays behind the black ink. General Dynamics never got to use any of it. By the time the Pakistani record could have been discussed openly, General Dynamics didn't exist anymore. Lockheed bought the Fort Worth division in 1993. The F-16's combat resume passed from one corporate owner to another, like a house with a sealed room that the new buyers weren't told about. Lockheed Martin inherited the most combat-proven light fighter in the Western inventory and had to sell it on spec sheets and red flag exercise results because the actual war record was stamped with caveats that made Pentagon lawyers break into hives. Meanwhile, the F-16 kept selling, kept winning contracts against the Gripen, the Rafale, the Eurofighter Consortium's offerings, the MiG-29. Country after country chose the Viper on the strength of its performance data and its logistics footprint, plus seamless integration with American weapon systems. None of those sales brochures mentioned Pakistan. The closest anyone came publicly was a retired Lockheed Martin executive who told Aviation Week in 2009 that the aircraft's combat record speaks for itself. in theaters we can discuss and theaters we can't. He was not invited to elaborate. A former Pakistani wing commander, not Anwar, not Alvi, one of the others whose name appears only in Urdu-language aviation forums and a single grainy photograph from a squadron dinner in 1987, gave an interview to a Pakistani defense blogger in 2014. The recording is 43 minutes long, mostly about training procedures, but near the end, the interviewer asks about the American relationship. The wing commander pauses for what the audio suggests is 6 or 7 seconds. "They built us the perfect sword," he says. "Then they asked us to pretend we had never drawn it." If the Pressler sanctions had fallen 2 years later, or the Soviet withdrawal had come 2 years earlier, or if the nuclear program at Kahuta had been someone else's problem, the calculus changes entirely. None of those things happened. The record compiled inside that narrow window became a ghost, haunting the margins of every F-16 foreign military sales pitch for the next 3 decades without ever being named directly. At Musharraf Air Base, the facility formerly known as Sargodha, Pakistani F-16s still fly. Block 52 variants now, purchased in a thaw that came after September 11, 2001, when America suddenly needed Pakistan again. The new jets carry the APG-68 radar, a full generation beyond what Anwar used over Miran Shah. The pilots who fly them are younger than the sanctions. They train on simulators that model threat environments their predecessors navigated with a radar warning receiver and instinct. The alert rotation at Musharraf runs 24 hours, 2 jets on the line, armed, pilots in the ready room. The next scramble order could come in 5 minutes or 5 months, 10 kills, 0 losses, 15 Sidewinders fired, 1 classified footnote, and a squadron patch that doesn't explain itself to visitors.